we go. Okay, good morning, everyone. So glad you all are here this morning. I am the Reverend Dr. Lorraine Leist. I am the Associate Pastor for Congregational Care and Older Adults here at Montview, and I'm so glad to see all of you here. Welcome to our Adult Faith Formation series called Aging Gracefully. There'll be two presentations, one this week and one next week. This week we have a caregiving panel, people who are going to talk about their caregiving experiences, and I'll let Rob introduce everyone in just a moment. And next week we're talking about, it'll be myself and a colleague, and we'll be talking about is dying more than a medical event? So be prepared for that. One thing I want to announce is that Linda Klein and I, on the 1st of February, will be hosting a caregiving workshop. So if you have an interest in being a part of a creative experience, if you know Linda, everything is creative, we will be having a creative caregiving workshop. There's a sign-up sheet in the back. If that is something that speaks to you, please do sign up, and I'll be in touch about that. I want to thank the Adult Faith Formation Committee for having us this morning, and I'm going to turn it over now to Rob Mathis, who will introduce our panel.
All right, good morning, everyone. For those of you that came to Adult Faith Formation last week, you had the displeasure of hearing from me. So 2 weeks in a row, I am sorry. That's just the way that the calendar worked out this year. So I hope you will bear with me. I have to first thank my panel, Lindsay Anderson, Carrie McConnell, and Susie King. It is not often you have to call up a friend and say, hi, I would really like you to come and speak in front of a group of people about some of the most difficult experiences in your life. And that's what I did this morning with all these guys, to come and share so that we can start a journey here at Montview that Lorraine is really leading up, that the church is leading up, that the session has, by creating her position, is beginning for our church, which is really kind of talking about parts of the congregation that maybe we haven't been serving as well, arguably. And, you know, that's our generation before me, and that's also people like me who found themselves all of a sudden in the sandwich generation, in the middle of caring for their parents and caring for their children. And so I'm just going to briefly talk about my experience last year, and then we're going to ask the panel to talk about it. So just last year, just barely over a year ago, I did not consider myself part of the caregiving or the sandwich generation. I was a parent, and I was pretty focused on being a parent and a career. And I spent Thanksgiving with my mom at her place down in Mexico, and came back up and went to a Wyoming football game with my stepmom. This is not a wicked stepmother situation. This was my stepmom of 33 years, been married to my dad for most of his life, and she had a cold. And, was at the game and was not herself, and I didn't think that much about it. 2 days later, she was in the hospital with what they thought was pneumonia. They tried a series of antibiotics and other treatments, and they were unsuccessful. Her care deteriorated very, very quickly. So that was mid-November. And by December 1st, I found myself flying up to Billings, Montana. She lived in a very small town in Wyoming, and so was getting care in Montana, where it was obvious that care for her was no longer an option. She was non-responsive. Her kidneys were in failure. She was using, equipment to breathe and feed. And unfortunately, my family was kind of not able to make the decisions that needed to be made. And so I flew up in the morning, met with the doctors by 11 o'clock, and by about noon was, holding my dad's hand, explaining what's going to happen next and the medications that they were going to give to ease her passing. And within less than 2 hours after I arrived in Billings, Montana, my two stepsisters and I were there with her as she passed. And so instantly I found myself caring for my father and helping him administer estates and start rebuilding and living his life. And so that was December of 2 years ago. And then About 3 weeks after that, my mom, as I said, she has a place in Mexico, came home. She hadn't been feeling well, and she was diagnosed with stage 4 esophageal cancer. It had already spread to her liver and her stomach, and my whole world changed. I was flying to Arizona to try to help her. About every 6 or 7 days, my brothers and I traded off, so I was living in Arizona more often than not, caring for my mom, helping her with chemotherapy, and eventually helping make some of those difficult decisions in life. Chemotherapy was wildly unsuccessful for my mom. Every time she had chemo, she ended up spending 10 to 20 days in the hospital. And finally, at the end of May last year, my older brother and I were with her when she also passed. And for those of you that know me, I'm a lawyer by trade, and so of course I was stuck with administering the estate and trying to help my family through that process. During the time I was caring for my mom, I had to do a lot of those really, really difficult decisions that we're going to talk about. Where are you for different things? My son, Derek, who as some of you may know, he runs around the church with probably more impunity than he should. He was asked with his friend Ethan Waite to give the children's service that Sandy always puts together on Mother's Day. But I had to be with my mom. I got to be with my mom for what turned out to be her last Mother's Day, and had to watch Derek, over the video. So those kind of things that you choose as a caregiver when you're caring for one person you love and making sacrifices for those around you. And it's just a series of decisions and challenges. And the whole point of inviting these people up here today is to share their stories and to start this larger dialogue in the church. If we have time, we're going to do some questions and answers. And I'll also invite people, if they just want to get up and briefly say, like, me too, I've done that, or I'm in that, or I think that might be next for me. I see that on my horizon. And so now that you've heard me for far longer than you wanted to, I'm gonna go back and start talking to these amazing people that have all been put in my life through this church and through this place at a time when, I really needed them the most. They, have all been incredible supports, and I'm just delighted that they could be here with me. So thank you guys all again for being here this morning. Lindsay, I'm going to start with you, and not just because of where you're seated. You have had caregiving roles most of your adult life. You had really good friends who got sick in high school and early in your college that you were there for. You then also cared for your mom and also Tommy's family, including some pretty major sacrifices about where you guys spent some of your time. So I was going to invite you next to share a little bit about your story and that the caregiving roles that you've had so far.
Let's test this. Oh dear. Hi, I'm Lindsay Anderson, and I'm a teacher, so I talk a lot, but not with a microphone. So this is my nightmare right here, so bear with me. I certainly had some caretaking roles early on, like you said. My best friend in high school had osteosarcoma, and so I was more just a friend. I would do sleepovers at the hospital sometimes, but I got the privilege of just being a witness and a friend to her more than a caregiver. When I was 22, my father had pancreatic cancer, and so I quit college for a little. I'm also a crier. So I moved back home and assisted my mom in caring for him in what was just a really painful disease. We got to be with him for 11 months as he went through treatment. And so that was my first kind of true caregiving experience, was watching my mom administer and care for him and attending all of his appointments with her to care for her and his physical needs. When a decade or so later, when COVID hit, my husband, his father got sick with skin cancer, melanoma, and was really, really advanced in his disease. And so my husband and I were both teachers and had the privilege of relocating to California to live with my father-in-law. His place was really small, so my husband lived with his dad and cared for him, did the feeding tubes. And the boys and I, we have 2 children who at that time were 3 and 7. We lived in an apartment about a mile away. But we had the privilege of visiting him every day and being with Papa Doug while my husband was truly the caregiver and had to make all of those decisions, of course, about end of life and palliative care and hospice. And so 6 months later, we're back in Denver after he passed away, and my mom called and said that they had found lung cancer throughout her whole body. So once again, just as we were still grieving my father-in-law, we were back in the cancer-giving journey. My mom lived in Westminster, luckily, so we live here in Central Park. We were nice and close. And unlike Rob's experience, my mom fared with chemotherapy very well. She was extremely sick when she was initially diagnosed, and then for a good chunk of the 22 months that she survived cancer, she felt really good because of the treatments. It really helped to ease the symptoms. And so my caretaking role at that time was just being with her and living with her during chemotherapy. So 3 days a week, every 3 weeks or so, and a couple of hospital stays and things like that sometimes come up with diseases, but it was really, very manageable as a mom and a wife and a teacher to be with her for so much of that disease. And then come November of 2022, we knew that she was at the end of her life, and so I took a leave of absence for about 8 weeks and lived with her full time. The hospice experience there was actually really difficult and traumatic for me. My father had been in a hospice care center for the last 7 days of his life, and so we as family members just got to be with him, holding his hand and praying with him, and it was really beautiful. And my mom's hospice experience was me. We had nurses who would come maybe every 5 days to check, and I had a nurse line that I could call, but I was administering medications at the end every 15 minutes, 24 hours a day, and so that was a really heavy burden that is taking some time to recover from. It was such a blessing to be with her and to spend all this time with her and to be with her at the end of her life. And then it was also really, really traumatic. So that's probably more than you wanted to know. But
No, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. So Carrie, you're actively in a caregiving role right now for your dad. And do you want to share what it's like to be actively in that process and how you balance everything since you're still really, really living it?
Okay, thanks, Rob. Thanks for having us, and thank you to everybody for sharing. And I am not a crier. I'm an inappropriate laugher. So, so if I laugh, then that's what I do with my feelings. But thanks for having us. A pretty different situation, but I can relate to what you shared, as I imagine a lot of other people can as well. Both my parents, my mom and my dad, are both in their 80s, and so there's things that they do on their own, and you know, things that they benefit from some support with. But they separated when I was in my late 20s. And when my dad retired, they were both living in Los Angeles. And when my dad retired, my mom moved to, my sister is living in a small town in northern Alabama. So my mom moved there to spend more time with my sister's kids and her grandkids. And then my dad, who grew up in Denver, was like, oh, you know, this would be a fun, you know, I'll move to Denver right after his retirement. And he was very independent when he moved here. He had a house in Cherry Creek North and went to the gym all the time and a nice group of friends. And just gradually over the last so, you know, it has been wonderful having him here in Denver. I'm his only family, and my family are his only family here in Denver. And probably within the last maybe 7 years, we started noticing, about 7 years ago, we started noticing just some memory lapses. And, you know, initially I was kind of, I'm embarrassed to say, but I was angry with him because I would I'm like, okay, let's have lunch. And then I would be driving to his house and I'd see him drive by me, you know, like he's going somewhere else, like in the totally opposite direction. And I'm like, oh, he doesn't care. Oh, he just doesn't care. It's not important. And I would get really angry with him because I'm like, we were supposed to be. And then it happened more and more. And at that time, he was, you know, he played a huge role in my son, Carson, sitting over there. He played a huge role in my son's life. He babysat. He was our go-to babysitter. He was our, you know, and Carson had this tradition of going to get pizza every Friday and then spending some time and going to museums. And, you know, he is the fix-it guy. And so he would come over and fix stuff around our house, and just, it was really fun. You know, we would go for walks, and it has always been really fun to spend time with him. And probably about 7 years ago, he didn't pick up Carson from school. He was supposed to pick up Carson from school, and he didn't pick up Carson from school. And I'm like, oh, like something's really going on, because he's never missed anything like that. And then the next day, he picked up Carson when he wasn't supposed to pick up Carson. So I got to school, and they're like, I don't know, he's not here. So then we started noticing something was going on. So over the past 7 years, we have, his memory has declined. It's not Alzheimer's, but it's more of a vascular type of dementia or cognitive impairment. So it's much more gradual. And but just over the last probably 7 years, we've seen his memory decline, and that's really what we've worked with. And I'm saying we because I'm definitely part of a family team. My sister and my mom, my parents are separated, but they're family. They're very, very close. And my family have really worked as a team to kind of help him maintain as much joy and as much independence as possible as his memory has declined, very gradually declined from being very independent, taking care of a house, mowing his own lawn, to not being able to manage his finances or manage his medication or manage his health. And so that's when we have lots of tricks and tools of the, tricks and things that have really helped in the process. But there's a lot of logistical stuff that we've worked with, and then also probably a lot of anticipatory grief, because he's not the same person he was. He's here, but he's not the same person he was 7 years ago, 10 years ago. And, he did a triathlon on his 80th birthday. And so he's not the same person, but he's still here. So that's sort of some of the emotions we're working with.
Susie. Although Susie doesn't look it, she's 2 or 3 years older than I am, and so she's been through both caregiving and the loss of her parents, but she's also was a very long-term caregiver for her spouse, Chip, a member of this community. And I was hoping you'd talk about that caregiving role, because that's one so many of our congregation are either in or thinking about right now.
Thanks, Rob. Well, I've given a lot of thought to this morning and tried to be prayerful about it in terms of what words would be most helpful to share. I'll just briefly say what my situation was. My husband, who we had a marriage that was to write stories about. It was the best. And he was diagnosed with prostate cancer when I was 49, and he was 52. And I had the oddest experience, which is not usually my norm because I always tend to be the optimist. But the day the doctor told us that it was cancer, I had this sinking feeling that this was going to be what would take him. And so I battled that for years. I actually had 12 years with Chip, for which I'm very, very grateful. But at the same time, I think to myself, all the things we did with the medical community when I was coping with this sort of gut feeling about what was going to happen changed him dramatically. The chemotherapy, everything, you know, he didn't have the energy. He wasn't the person that he had always been. But that didn't diminish my love for him. But I think in terms of thinking about this morning, I have been really reflective on how that feels today to me. I can tell you it was, you know, there were difficult times and times that weren't so difficult, but as I reflect back now, and it's been almost 14 years since he's been gone, so I lived through a long caregiving, but I'm also living through a long sort of grief span. But as I've thought about it, I really have reflected on the idea of the fact that I felt so alone. And I'm so grateful for this group and what the church is doing for Lorraine, because we're talking about these things. Because I had great friends at the time, but I didn't want to burden them. And I felt so alone in terms of not having my best friend to talk to about what we could do to solve this, because I was trying to be supportive. So one thing I would say about caregiving is that there are moments of complete confusion in terms of how to react to that role. The next thing I would say is that openness and transparency strike me as incredibly important. And I think it's really a gift if we can talk about what's going on, not only with the person to whom we're giving care, but with others. And our family, particularly. If I hate to use the word guilt, but if I were a person who used the word guilt, I suppose I'm feeling more regret about the way my daughter and I dealt with it. Because I should have been there for her, as there wasn't the talk of the sandwich. So I was focused on Chip. And I tried to, I went through a bit of a rough time with daughter during middle school, and that's just when he was diagnosed. So I really, I really feel like transparency and conversation with family is incredibly important. And in fact, right now, you know, I sort of was laughing to myself that now I'm in the position of probably thinking I need a caregiver, you know? And so what I have learned from this experience is to talk to my daughter about exactly what's going on with me, both physically and mentally and spiritually. And she and I are in a place of best friendship that I can't even describe. But I think that's largely related to the honesty of our relationship today. And so I encourage all of you to think very hard about how to talk to your kids and be as open as possible. And I'll just say one more thing. I was lucky enough to have been put in touch with a grief therapist as I was walking this walk. So for the last maybe 6 or 8 months of Chip's life, I went weekly to see this woman, and I think it saved my life. So there are things that the caregiver must do for him or herself, and that's something that is forgotten so often when you're in the midst of giving the care. So, and I don't think that's selfish at all. She has continued to help me. We actually became friends after the experience that I had, which worried her that we'd had a professional relationship, but we became very good friends. And I think every time I see her, I just feel gratitude, which leads me to my final point, which is thank the good Lord that we have our faith, because I don't know how anybody gets through the trauma and the challenge of surviving this kind of experience, which we all have to go to, because we don't just know that death and taxes exist. We know that death exists. When we're born, we're on the path to death. So I think that we just need to know that as long as we have our faith and we know the reality of life and death and the process, we will get through this. Thank you.
So Susie really highlighted kind of the next question I wanted to have, because as a caregiver, I didn't take very good care of myself. I was willing to kind of burn the candle at both ends, as they say. I know I have friends that would have helped me. I know that they're there, but I had to ask, and I didn't want to. I was scared to, and I want to acknowledge that, the way you just did, how hard it is sometimes for the caregiver to ask for help. And so I want to ask anyone who wants to answer, were you able to ask for help? What were the impediments there too? And for people who are here with us today or watching, what advice would you give to give the caregiver permission to ask for help?
I don't know that I did a good job of asking either. But I did have people in my life who had experienced this, and so they were very generous in offering and giving. My husband obviously was just amazing as I lived separate from the family for so long. He would bring the boys to me every weekend, and he just held down the fort and gave me just complete understanding and love, which I am so incredibly grateful for. I had friends who would just say, what day can I drop by a meal? And that was really helpful. I still need to work on that, instead of saying, may I or can I, what do you need? Just doing something. So just bringing over the food. I had somebody bring their cleaner to my house, which I don't have a cleaner, and it was amazing to just walk back into a house that was cleaned. So any acts of service, reaching out, texts. I had friends who would send me beautiful messages and prayers via text. Just that helped a lot. But I certainly didn't do a good job of really caring for myself physically and emotionally during the experience. And then I think I paid for it with how I grieved afterwards, of just needing to take even more time from work because I had nothing left to give. So finding ways to tap people in to give you that respite, if it is another family member, or paying somebody to come stay with your loved one if they're needing full-time care, it's really, really important. I didn't get a lot of time away from full-time caregiving. My brother wanted to help and had his own struggles in being able to fully show up all the time. So talking about options like that, looking at options, even paying for somebody to come give you just that break, I think would be really helpful.
Because our process has been so gradual, it's really something that I don't know if I asked for help, but by some grace of, help has fallen in my lap many, 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 many times, and I'm so grateful for that. I think there's so much, there has been so much to manage as my dad's memory has declined. His finances was a huge part, his medication, his medical visits, and as he, as his memory declined, like his ability to have conversations, he can still hold a conversation, and he's very smart, so he presents very, very well, so sometimes but he's also just, because connecting with people got harder and harder with him, just the extreme loneliness and living by himself and feeling so lonely became so challenging. So honestly, I could have spent every living, waking moment with my dad. He could have moved in with us and just been he couldn't have moved in with us, but it could have taken 24/7, truly. And because I have a family and a job and over the process, I really needed to take care of myself. We've had a lot of help. One of probably the best investments we made was meeting with an aging care specialist, and she was a geriatric, she's a social worker that focuses with an emphasis on gerontology, and we bought a package from her, and she spent time with him and talked to where he was living, talked to everybody there, talked to us, and at the end we met, and she really kind of identified some key points and helped us prioritize. And there were also some things where she's like, you guys need to let that go. Just, that's not going to be perfect. You need to let it go. But she provided a lot of resources and an expert opinion that really helped us create a map as we've continued to navigate this. And I think a lot of asking for help was, we have someone, a woman who works part-time, and, she's taken him for drives. And I know that I could take him for drives, but, I spend a lot of time in the car driving family and driving to work, and so that was just something that we found a lovely person to take him for drives. And the place where he lives now will take him to doctor's appointments, and then I'll call not necessarily the super, super important doctor's appointments, but like the dermatologist and the dentist, and then I'll call and follow up afterwards. So there are things that I'm like, well, no one can do it as well as I can. But so some of it has also just been letting other people help, and it's also been good for his independence. Somebody called me, someone took him to the hearing aid appointment last week, and the woman from the hearing aid appointment has sort of adopted him. So she calls and she's like, well, this is what we need. This is his next appointment. So what I found is the more that I can let go and let other people help, a lot of people will take on, and they're like, okay, well, he came in and, and this was well. She's like, but you really need to have the person who drives him to the appointment come in with him, because he tried to get in someone else's car. When he left, he didn't remember what their car looked like, so he went and tried to get into someone else's car. And I talked to my sister, and I'm like, okay, do we need someone to go in? And I'm like, you know what, I bet he figured it, that's part of independence. And it didn't distress him. He probably laughed about it and was like, oh, I'm over here. So we really had to think and be like, you know what, he can go into doctor's appointments by himself, and if it's not perfect, and he wasn't distressed by it. Like, if he was really distressed, then we would have worked on it, but he wasn't, he didn't even mention it. So we're like, okay, we're gonna not send someone in, and he still maintains the aspect of going into doctor's appointments by himself, because he's an adult, and And so, help has come in so many different forms along the way. And I think you're going to ask a question about the role of faith coming up. Okay, so I will. That also has been an amazing part of the help process, but I'll.
Do you want to talk about your ability to ask for help? Because I know from our friendship, you weren't amazing at that, maybe at the time.
I'm still not great at asking for help, I have to admit. But I think, that we have to be gentle with ourselves and really just try to, when one finds oneself in this role, we have to love ourselves through it, because that's all we really have in terms of giving us strength and power. Because all I can say from all the years that I did it, I made lots of errors. And I think back on all the friends I could have asked for help if I had been willing to be vulnerable, which is also a trait that I don't enjoy a lot. But I think that we each need to know that when you're in a situation that is a challenge, people who love you want to help.
As Carrie said, I do want to talk about faith next, and I'll share a little bit of my own story. I've had two moments in my life where I unquestionably felt the presence of God. The first was when I was in high school and I was questioning religion and trying to figure out what I was going to do, and there was just a moment when it happened. And the other was then most recently on May 30th when my mom passed. My older brother and I were there with her in the long-term care facility that turned out to be less than 24 hours for her by the time we got her there. And we were with her as her breathing slowed, and you could just feel kind of the heaviness in the room as my older brother and I were trying to hold it together. And she was wrapped in a prayer shawl that someone from this congregation had beautifully made for her. And I was holding her hand, and my brother was standing as close as he could. And all at once, at what turned out to be the moment, I swear the room got warmer. I swear an absolute feeling of grace bordering on joy at the moment I knew my mom was passing overwhelmed me. I knew she was passing. I knew it was going to be okay. And I knew that she was kind of moving on to whatever in the world is really, really next. But in that moment, my faith was assured in a way it hadn't been in 30 years. With absolute conviction, every part of my body knew that my faith in something greater was fully and completely justified, and that she was embraced in a moment of love and comfort that honestly was as beautiful as it ever gets. And so I knew at that time, and all through the process when my mom was going through things, I was surrounded by people that I knew were praying with me and were praying for me. Those little text messages, people that I know are real experts at intercessory prayer, had me on their list. And it was only through that faith that I was able to strengthen and resolve myself. And that was just my kind of moment in my journey. And I think you guys all wanted to share about that. And so I'll invite you guys in any order to talk about how faith sustained you, or the role faith played as you were in that caregiving, and what role it plays now.
Thank you for sharing that beautiful moment. I wish I had something where I had that certainty, and I didn't have that beautiful, miraculous moment of just peace. I've had moments like glimpses of it, And a lot of it is truly in how people show their love to each other. We know whenever there's love, there's God. And I just felt so cared for through prayers and friends reaching out during that time. I spent a lot of time praying throughout my mom's illness and throughout my grieving process. It's still something I'm obviously working through today. I think it was complicated for me in caring for my mom because my mom found church to be very sad. It reminded her of losing her husband, and so she wanted to find comfort in it and couldn't. And so I kind of felt guilty that I did find comfort in coming to church and having people pray for me and praying for her. I don't know that that makes any logical sense, but I certainly felt love from everyone checking in on me, asking how I was, those who knew what I was going through. But I've certainly felt my mom's presence since she's passed. And I just know in those moments with those songs or those visits to my dreams that is her and God telling me that she is fine and that this is how it is supposed to be.
I can think of just three, because once again, it's a gradual process. So I can think of three specific examples of the role, and then I can think of a million little examples, but of kind of the role of the church community and of faith in this journey. The first one, which doesn't really have anything to do with my dad at all, but it does, is about 12 years ago, I was on the deacon board, and someone asked if I wanted to give a woman, a parishioner who had just lost her husband, a ride to church. And I'm like, okay, I can do that. She lives really close to us, so I can do that. I'll give her a ride. That's no problem. And then some kind of how it evolved into me being part of the companion ministry program, and I don't know if that's still okay. But it was it was maybe like a 3-year, and my son was really little at the time. He was probably 2 until he was about 5 or 6. We drove this woman, this parishioner, to church every day, and she passed. The relationship ended when she passed, but it was such a powerful. She was such an amazing example. When I saw her, I'm like, that's how I want to do it. That is how I want to pass, because she was such a great example of the process. And she didn't have family in town, so as time went by, she we kind of took on different roles, but my son developed a relationship with her, and I remember her last words to him before she passed, he went over there and played his bagpipes like the chanter for her, and she said, "I'm so proud of you." And it was just such, and I'm like, that's the way I want to do it. So I think one of the things through that relationship, I think Carson and I probably got way more out of that relationship than she did. She got a ride to church, but we just got so much out of it just because I saw some of the beauty, and it took a little bit of the fear away about, just that process of life. For my dad, the community, as he just has had more trouble establishing relationships, just the opportunity to come to church every week and have someone say hi, and to sit on committees and be a contributing part of the church has been amazing. And then finally, I there's so many emotions that go along with having a parent in this stage. I don't want to parent my dad. I want my dad to parent me. Just this shift, and there's so many feelings associated with it. So I'm so grateful for the opportunity. I met with Pastor Lorraine multiple times and sat down at a coffee shop and in your office and just had the chance to just talk about just the complexity of these feelings, my anger, my frustration, my guilt, just all of these feelings associated with it. And so that's played a huge role in I guess, the process. So thank you.
I said that faith has been so important to me. I think hearing your stories has made me think, when Chip went into hospice care, I was told he'd probably last 3 to 5 days, and he lasted 7 weeks. So everything in my experience was sort of unique, but he really didn't want to go. And he would tell me he didn't want to leave me. Which also was hard, because it was hard for me to say, you need to go. But it was a challenge. Anyway, I'm just quickly going to tell you that at the very end, last week maybe, I think Allison, my daughter, made a list of people who came by the house. And I think 80 or so people that last week came by to just go in and say hello to him, which meant the world. But I'm sort of a private person, so I didn't know how to deal with, and I'm an introvert, so I didn't know exactly how to deal with that. But on the final day, and I think I knew it was the day he was going to pass, people kept calling and saying, can I come over? And so ultimately by the evening, there were maybe 12 or 15 people at the house. And Allie and I were a little concerned to be playing host. And so she looked at me at maybe 6 o'clock and she said, Mom, should I offer people drinks? And I said, well, that sounds like a good idea. So she did. And so everybody had a cocktail of some sort. And I don't know how it happened, but we all ended up in the room where he was. So, and it was my bedroom, and we had a hospital bed. But so we're all in there together, and there was some chatter. And I never got along well with my mother-in-law, which was a sadness for me. But one of my very close friends said, Suze, I think the reason that Chip isn't going, it's because he doesn't want to see his mother again. And that is exactly what happened in the room. Everyone started laughing, and it was at that moment that he passed. And I have thought to this day that he was waiting to know that I would be able to laugh and get along without him.
We'll try to do one more question, and then we'll open it up to people, because I know the choir's already slipped out, and the parents are going to have to get their kiddos from Sunday school here before too long. But if you guys had one piece of advice to give to someone who's about to be caregiving or is caregiving, what would it be? And would it involve talking with your loved one and understanding what they want and need? Is it about how to ask for help? Is it about, what would you ask someone, or what advice would you give to someone who's in a caregiving role?
I don't know that this is advice for if you're a caregiver, but one of the biggest blessings that I had through this experience with my mom was her knowing what was coming. She had been a caregiver, and so she did everything that she could think of to ease the burden for me, especially the logistics, because it's just this horrible, cruel thing that when you are just at the bottom, you're broken in grief, you have to do a lot of logistical things. There are a lot of phone calls and reports to be made and accounts to close, and it's just not where you have bandwidth. So she organized file folders for me of a list of who to call and what to do. She had all of these passwords listed out for me. She had notes. And that just was a blessing because you have to do all of these things, especially if you're the executor after somebody passes. And so having conversations about what she wanted at the end of her life, there's a really simple document, the 5 wishes, which isn't super hard to fill out, but I knew what sort of environment she wanted at the end of her life, what music she wanted to listen to, how she wanted her service to be, and that helped ease a lot of the things that you have to deal with in life after you lose someone you love.
I think probably some of the things that have been most helpful is talking to people and hearing, it can feel very isolating, but it's like you mentioned, I mean, as soon as you're born, you're on a path. And so a lot of people have been through it, and there's a lot of resources. And so talking to people, I felt like we were, kind of finding places to live. I didn't know the difference between a 55 plus or independent living or assisted living or skilled nursing, and just talking to people and finding resources, and also knowing that we have tried so many things that haven't worked, and there are a lot of things that we're like, wow, that really, that's really it. That's really helped my dad maintain as much joy and independence as possible, and also us, support him in the process. So talking to people about their experience and hearing what's worked for them has really helped this process.
And I just have very quick, but I mentioned the grief therapist that I worked with. That was wonderful, but specifically what she helped me with was, and I'm thinking of you, Lindsay, in terms of the hospice care. We had a hospice group come in to help us, and I went to see my friend and told her that I had some issues, and she looked at me without missing a beat and said, fire them, and fire them. And I said, really, can you fire a hospice team? And she said, fire them. And that was the best piece of advice I was given, because that group left, the most wonderful group came in, and it was night and day. So assert your power, but sometimes it takes somebody to tell you you have that power.
The two I would give, and Lindsay touched on it, if you are a parent or someone who's facing kind of difficult times, the passwords is incredibly, incredibly important. There are hundreds of them, and it's difficult. There are some services, SiriusXM, like they did not want to quit. And I'm like, you don't understand. Like, no, I don't need to transfer this to her new car. There's not going to be a new car. And so that's the other thing I would say is, and this is one that is born from some of my own regret, have the hard conversations with your family member. Making sure they have a document in place and wills or trusts in place is not going to make them go any faster. It's not going to hasten whatever's coming next. Talk about services. I had to guess which song my mom would want played at our service, because even though I had borrowed a hymnal and I had it in the backpack when I was in my mom's caregiving room, I couldn't bring it out and have that conversation with her in the end, because I knew it was going to scare her. And I didn't want to do it when it all of a sudden had come for her and for me too late in that process. I would have loved to have known that the music that I picked out was what she wanted. And while it was a huge comfort to me, I would have loved her endorsement on that. So have those hard conversations, because it's not going to make things different. It's not going to make things happen faster. It's only going to make it easier and better for everyone involved. So I invite you to have those conversations before just before. With that, and we are getting low on time, I know that, so do we have time for one question, or do we need to wrap up, Lorraine?
We have time for maybe one or two quick questions. Would love to see if there's anybody who wants to even comment to say I'm a caregiver too.
Thank you very much. This is a wonderful use of time. This is the essence of being church, so thank you for what you've done. I wanted to just add one more thing to put on the list for future engagement, and that is, as the youngest of three boys, whose mother chose 9 years ago to move out here for her late years and is still going strong. I thought the youngest got a free pass kind of thing, but it's the good fortune of marrying well, because she moved out to be close to Maryland, and I just happened to be married to her. And so 9+ years later, the challenge to put on the list, though, is when your family is not that wonderful group of siblings or step-siblings, but they are the biggest part of your problem, where your oldest brother is now 16 months homeless, and he decides in Georgia to take the little bit of money the family gives him, and rather than carry out a plan that looks like help, to secretly fly here and try to become my mom's roommate in her assisted living facility, which meant 48 hours later, I had the sheriff escorting him out of the facility, and now have a protective order against my brother. So those kind of dynamics. Or a middle brother who is the financial power of attorney, but basically has handed it over to his wife, who passionately does not like my personality because I ask the wrong questions. So those kind of dynamics make this day-to-day process extremely challenging, and is a whole nother part of the process of trying to comfort yourself through helping your mother with life with a family that's not there. So there's a whole nother level of support there that needs kind of care and nurturing as well. And yeah, with the mother with Alzheimer's who doesn't really understand, and I'm trying to protect her from most of this conversation.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Okay. Just a very quick note. I've had 20 members of my family passed away and been with their deathbed and so on. And I always wondered, but here's what I want to pass on to you. Did you know that the auditory nerve is the first nerve to be developed? In other words, the fetus can hear. Did you also know it's the last one to go? And my sister said, Mom, it's okay to go. And she heard it.
What a beautiful note to end on. I want to say thank you to Rob and Susie and Lindsay and Carrie for your beautiful sharing, for your vulnerability and willingness to tell us your experience. So thank you all for coming, and look forward to next week.